Hey, you ever stop and really think about some of the big questions? The ones that kind of sit in the back of your mind? Like, why are we even here? And if there's this all-powerful, all-knowing God, does everything really make sense? Because here's something that's been bugging me. Something that might even sound a little crazy at first. You know how we're told that God created us to worship Him? Makes sense on the surface, right? But then you hear that this same God is supposed to be completely self-sufficient, needing absolutely nothing. Now, maybe you've heard the explanations, the ones about how we need Him, not the other way around. And yeah, that sounds nice. But if that's the case, why all the demands? Why the rules? The threats of eternal punishment if we don't get it exactly right? It's like being told someone is totally independent, but they're constantly checking up on you, making sure you're praising them enough. Something feels a little off, doesn't it? Well, today, we're going way beyond that surface level. We're going to dive deep into the core of this idea, pull apart the logic, and ask some really uncomfortable questions about the very nature of our creation and the being who supposedly made us. Trust me, this rabbit hole goes deeper than you might think, and what we find might just change how you look at everything. Stick around, because this is going to get interesting. Okay, so we've touched on this, but let's really sink our teeth into this central idea. The apparent contradiction at the heart of the Islamic concept of Allah. On the one hand, the Quran very clearly states in Surah Al-Dhariyat 51:56 that the very purpose of our creation, and that of the jinn, is to worship Allah. Let that sink in for a second. The ultimate goal of our existence, according to this verse, is to engage in acts of worship directed towards this deity. But then, you flip a few pages, and you find Allah described as the eternally self-sufficient, independent of all, Himself in no need of anything. The Arabic term used here, al-Samad, carries a powerful meaning of absolute self-sufficiency. Someone who is eternally independent and requires nothing from anyone or anything. Now here's where the logical gears start to grind a bit. If you are truly self-sufficient, if you genuinely need nothing, then why would you create beings specifically for the purpose of worshiping you? Think about it in human terms. If I were to constantly tell everyone how completely independent I am, how I don't rely on anyone for anything, but then I went around demanding that everyone constantly praise me, acknowledge my greatness, and perform specific rituals in my honor, wouldn't you find that a little contradictory? It suggests a need, a craving for validation, which directly undermines the idea of being truly independent. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking, because this is a very common response. Muslims often say, Allah doesn't need our worship, it's we who need Him. And to support this, they often quote Surah Fatir 35:15, which translates to, O humanity, it is you who stand in need of Allah, but Allah alone is the self-sufficient, praiseworthy. And on the surface, this might sound like a reasonable explanation. But let's dig a little deeper, shall we? While the verse states that we need Allah, it's Allah Himself, through the Quran and Hadith, who lays down a very specific set of demands. He dictates how we should pray, how often, what we should say, how we should fast, what we should give in charity, and a whole host of other rules and regulations. And what happens if we don't comply with these demands? Well, the consequences, according to the same scriptures, are pretty severe. Eternal torture in hellfire. Think of it like this. Imagine a billionaire who constantly tells everyone they don't need a single penny from anyone. They are the epitome of financial independence. But then, this same billionaire sets up a system where everyone in the world has to send them a specific amount of money every day, and if they don't, they'll be locked in a dark room forever. Would you really buy the argument that this billionaire doesn't need the money? The act of demanding it, especially with such extreme consequences for non-compliance, suggests a very real need for that money, or at the very least, a desire for that power and control. So when we look at Allah's claim of being eternally self-sufficient, alongside the explicit statement that we were created to worship Him, and the severe punishments for failing to do so correctly, it creates a significant paradox. A truly self-sufficient being wouldn't need worship, wouldn't demand it, and certainly wouldn't threaten eternal damnation for failing to provide it. This raises some fundamental questions about the nature of this deity and the real reasons behind mankind's creation. We've talked about the why of our creation being a bit problematic, but what about the how, or more accurately, the without our asking? Think about it for a second. Did any of us actually get a notification, an email, a cosmic invitation asking if we'd like to be brought into existence? Were we presented with the terms and conditions of this life, this so-called test, with the potential for eternal bliss on one side and eternal torture on the other? The answer, of course, is a resounding no. We were simply brought into this world without our consent, thrown into this grand cosmic play whether we liked it or not. And this leads us to a really crucial point within Islamic theology, the concept of predestination. It's not just that we didn't agree to be here, but according to Islamic tradition, the entire course of our lives and our ultimate destination in the afterlife was already decided long before we even took our first breath. There are some pretty clear references to this in the Hadith. For instance, there's a well-known one in Sahih Jami at-Tirmidhi 2155, where the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is reported to have said, "Verily the first of what Allah created was the pen. So He said, 'Write.' It said, 'What shall I write?' He said, 'Write al-Qadar, what it is and what shall be until the end.'" Al-Qadar here refers to divine decree or predestination. So, right at the beginning of creation, everything that was, is, and will be was already written down. And it doesn't stop there. Another significant hadith found in Sahih al-Bukhari 1362 states, "There is none among you, and not a created soul, but has place either in paradise or in hell assigned for him, and it is also determined for him whether he will be among the blessed or wretched." So, let's really process what these traditions are saying. If our place in paradise or hell is already assigned, if it was written down before we even existed, then what meaningful choice do we actually have? What's the point of this life being presented as a test if the outcome is already predetermined? It feels a bit like being forced to play a game where the winner and loser have already been decided before the first move is made. Imagine you're forced to take an exam, but before you even see the questions, the examiner tells you, "Okay, your grade is already decided. You're either going to pass or fail, and there's nothing you can do to change that." Would you really consider that a fair assessment of your knowledge or effort? Probably not. It would feel completely pointless. Similarly, if our eternal fate is already sealed, regardless of the choices we make during our finite existence. The concept of a test loses all its meaning and integrity. It raises serious questions about individual agency and the very notion of divine justice. If the end is already written, are we really anything more than characters playing out a script we had no hand in writing? Now, consider these words directly from the Quran. Surah Al-Araf 7, 178 to 179. Whom Allah doth guide, he is on the right path. Whom he rejects from his guidance, such are the persons who perish. Many are the jinns and men we have made for hell. Let that sink in. It's not just saying that some people happen to go astray. This verse explicitly states that Allah rejects guidance from some, causing them to perish, and even more disturbingly, that many among both humans and jinn were made for hell. Not that they chose it, not that they necessarily did anything to deserve it in their limited time on earth, but that they were, in essence, created for this eternal suffering. And this isn't an isolated verse. Surah As-Sajda 32:13 reinforces this idea, stating, "Had we willed, we could have easily imposed guidance on every soul. But my word will come to pass. I will surely fill up hell with jinn and humans all together." So according to this, Allah has the power to guide every single soul, to ensure everyone ends up on the right path. But he chooses not to. He actively decides that some will receive this guidance, while others will not. And as a result, hell will be filled with both jinn and humans. Now, how do we reconcile this with the commonly held belief that Allah is all just and all merciful? If a being has the power to guide everyone away from eternal torment, but consciously chooses not to, and even goes as far as creating beings specifically for hell, can we truly call that justice? It seems to suggest a system where the deck is stacked from the very beginning. Some individuals are, by design, set up to fail this test we didn't even ask to be a part of. Think about it from a human perspective. If you created a game where some players were given all the advantages and others were programmed to lose, no matter how hard they tried, would that be considered a fair game? Would you be seen as a just creator of that game? Probably not. You'd likely be accused of rigging the system. And yet, here we have a scenario where a supposedly all-powerful and all-just God is depicted as actively creating individuals destined for eternal suffering, simply because he willed it. This raises a profound and uncomfortable question. If Allah is truly just, how can he create beings whose ultimate fate is eternal torment, not because of their free will choices in a fair environment, but because he either withheld guidance from them or, as the verses suggest, even made them specifically for that purpose? It's a concept that seems fundamentally at odds with the very idea of a benevolent and equitable deity. Let's be honest here. If you knew someone in your life who constantly demanded your attention, your praise, your unwavering loyalty, and threatened you with severe punishment if you didn't comply, what would you think of that person? You'd probably label them as narcissistic, right? Someone with an inflated sense of self-importance and a desperate need for validation. So when we look at a deity who explicitly states that the very reason for our existence is to worship him, and who threatens us with eternal hellfire for simply not acknowledging him as the one true God, regardless of our good deeds or intentions, it's hard not to see some parallels. Think about it. Eternal damnation for not believing in a specific set of doctrines? That's a pretty extreme consequence for what boils down to a lack of belief. Consider the billions of kind, compassionate, and ethical people throughout history and in the world today who were born into different cultures, different belief systems, or no belief system at all. According to this framework, their inherent goodness, their positive contributions to humanity, their genuine efforts to live a moral life, all of that becomes meaningless if they don't subscribe to the specific tenets of Islam. They are, by default, condemned to eternal suffering simply for not believing in Allah. Where is the justice in that? And it's not just about belief, is it? Even those who do believe are under constant pressure to worship properly, 5 times a day, facing a specific direction, following a detailed set of rituals. Fail to do this correctly, and you risk severe punishment in the afterlife. It's a system that seems to prioritize adherence to specific forms of worship over genuine compassion and ethical behavior. Then there's the incredibly troubling idea that Allah might inflict suffering, disease, or even death upon innocent newborns and children as a means to test the faith of others or to impart some kind of lesson. How can a truly loving and merciful being deliberately cause such pain and anguish to the most vulnerable among us? Is this the action of a benevolent creator? Or does it suggest a being willing to resort to extreme measures to achieve some inscrutable purpose? It feels more like a spiteful attempt to manipulate and control through fear and desperation. Finally, let's not forget the Islamic narrative about angels being compelled to worship Allah without any free will. While often presented as a display of Allah's greatness, from another perspective, it reinforces this idea of a being who desires constant, unquestioning adoration. If the goal was to create beings with free will who choose to worship, why create another entire realm of beings who have no choice in the matter? Ultimately, when we put all of this together, the demand for worship under threat, the condemnation of good people for lack of belief, the punishment for improper rituals, the infliction of suffering on the innocent, and the compelled worship of angels, it paints a picture that is difficult to reconcile with the idea of unconditional love and selfless benevolence. It raises serious questions about whether this is a relationship built on genuine love and understanding, or one based on a power dynamic where obedience and adoration are demanded, not freely given. So, we often hear this idea that life itself is a precious gift, and the trials and tribulations we face, the so-called test, are just a small hurdle to jump over in exchange for an eternity of unimaginable bliss in paradise. But let's put that to the test, shall we? Imagine you were standing at a crossroads, and you were given a choice. Option A, you get to experience life, with all its joys and sorrows, its fleeting moments of happiness, but also with the very real possibility of failing this test and facing eternal torture. Option B, you simply don't exist at all. You avoid all the potential suffering, all the anxiety of this high-stakes gamble. Which option would you honestly choose? For me, personally, the sheer terror of eternal torment is so overwhelming that I'd have to lean towards option B. No amount of earthly pleasures, no matter how wonderful, could ever outweigh the risk of such a horrific and irreversible punishment? And if that's the case, can we really call this gift one that we would freely choose if we were truly informed of the potential consequences? This brings me to another interesting point. Islam very clearly prohibits gambling and the charging of interest, often with the reasoning that these practices involve high risk that isn't worth the potential reward. It's seen as exploitative and potentially harmful. Yet, when we look at this concept of life as a test, we're essentially being forced into the ultimate gamble, with the highest possible stakes imaginable. Eternal paradise versus eternal hellfire. Where's the consistency here? If Allah deems a financial gamble with earthly consequences as wrong, why does He impose this cosmic gamble with infinitely greater risks? Furthermore, this test isn't being conducted on a level playing field. Think about all the factors that influence what we believe and how we live our lives. Where you're born geographically plays a massive role. Someone born into a devout Muslim family in a country like Saudi Arabia will likely have a very different worldview and set of beliefs than someone born into a secular household in Sweden or a Hindu family in India. Your upbringing, your culture, your social environment, the education you receive, even the personal experiences you have, all of these things shape your understanding of the world and what you find to be true. And let's not forget the Islamic concept of Iblis, the literal embodiment of evil, supposedly whispering in our ears, trying to lead us astray. Ultimately, we are not responsible for what compels us to believe or disbelieve. Our beliefs are formed through a complex interplay of factors, many of which are entirely outside of our control. You can read the Quran and its commentaries 1,000 times with an open mind, but if it doesn't resonate with you, if it doesn't logically convince you, are you truly at fault for that? Are you deserving of eternal torture simply because you weren't persuaded by a particular set of claims, especially when your entire life experience might have led you to different conclusions? So, when we consider the lack of informed consent in being created, the terrifyingly high stakes of this test, the inconsistency with Islamic prohibitions on gambling, and the overwhelming influence of factors beyond our control on our beliefs, it's hard to see this life as a fair or just examination. It feels more like being thrown into a game with preset rules and potentially devastating consequences, without ever having the chance to say, actually, I'd rather not play. Think for a moment about trying to truly wrap your head around the idea of infinity, whether it's an endless expanse of space, a number that goes on forever, or time without beginning or end. Our brains, which evolved to navigate the practical realities of our finite existence, really struggle with these concepts. We can talk about them, we can do the math, but to truly comprehend them on an intuitive level is incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Now, take that limitation and apply it to the idea of eternal punishment in hell. We're talking about suffering that goes on forever, without any possibility of relief or end. It's a concept that is so far removed from our everyday experiences and our understanding of time that it becomes almost entirely abstract. We can feel a sense of dread when we hear about it, but can we truly grasp the magnitude of eternity of torment? I seriously doubt it. This inherent difficulty in comprehending infinity might also explain, at least in part, why the threat of hell while undoubtedly terrifying to many, doesn't always act as the most effective deterrent against actions deemed sinful. Our brains are more attuned to immediate, tangible consequences. The idea of something happening in an unimaginable future, on an infinite timescale, can sometimes feel distant and less impactful than, say, the immediate consequences of breaking a social norm or facing legal repercussions. Now, some might bring up a hadith found in Sahih Muslim 2749, which states, "By him in whose hand is my life, if you were not to commit sin, Allah would sweep you out of existence, and he would replace you by those people who would commit sin and seek forgiveness from Allah, and he would have pardoned them." The argument here is often that Allah desires repentance and forgiveness, and thus needs sinners to exist. But let's unpack that. If Allah created us with inherent flaws, knowing that we would inevitably sin, and that repentance doesn't necessarily guarantee forgiveness for everyone, as some interpretations suggest, how does that align with the idea of an all-just God? Are we essentially created to fulfill a divine need for repentance, even if it means many of us will face eternal punishment for actions that are, in a sense, built into our very nature? Ultimately, we're back to this fundamental issue of proportionality. We are finite beings, living finite lives, capable of finite actions, both good and bad. To then face a punishment that is infinite in its duration and intensity for these finite actions, especially when our very capacity to understand that infinity is limited, feels incredibly disproportionate and, frankly, unjust. We are forced to navigate this complex test with a cognitive toolkit that struggles to even comprehend the stakes involved. It's like asking a toddler to understand advanced calculus and then punishing them for failing the exam with a punishment they can't even fathom. It simply doesn't add up. So, the standard answer you'll often hear in Islam is that Allah created mankind for the sole purpose of worshiping him. That's what Quran tells us. But when you really think about it, this raises a few immediate questions. Allah already had the angels, who, as we've discussed, are in a constant state of worship. Sure, they might be described as lacking free will, almost like divine automatons. But then you have to wonder if the goal was. When you press for a more fundamental reason, you'll often hear responses like, "God's ways are mysterious," or "Human minds can't possibly comprehend the divine plan." While I understand the desire to find comfort in such explanations, from a rational perspective, it feels more like an admission that there isn't a clear, logical answer within the framework of Islamic doctrine. It's a way of shutting down further inquiry rather than providing genuine understanding. This is where the approach of science stands in stark contrast. While science doesn't claim to have all the answers to the why of our existence, and in fact readily admits what it doesn't know, it focuses on the how. Through observation, experimentation, and the rigorous testing of hypotheses, science has provided us with an increasingly detailed understanding of the origins of the universe, the formation of our planet, and the evolution of life. And crucially, science is humble enough to say, "We don't know yet," when faced with unanswered questions, rather than resorting to explanations that are inherently unfalsifiable. Religions, on the other hand, often claim to possess all the answers, the ultimate truths about existence. Yet, when it comes to this most basic question, why are we here? The answers provided often fall short of being truly satisfying from a rational standpoint. We're told it's for worship, but the initial motivation behind even creating beings capable of worship remains elusive and shrouded in mystery. It leaves you wondering if the answer isn't so much divinely revealed as it is simply absent. So, the story goes that Allah created Adam and Eve and placed them in paradise with all its delights. However, they were forbidden from eating the fruit of one particular tree. Along comes Iblis, the rebellious jinn, who manages to deceive them into disobeying Allah's command. As a result of this transgression, they are cast down to earth, and this fall is often presented as the reason for all the suffering and hardship that humanity has since endured. Now, here's where things start to get a bit problematic for me. This original sin, this act of disobedience by Adam and Eve, is often portrayed as something that has tainted all of their descendants. That's every single human being who has ever lived or will live. We're all supposedly bearing the burden of something we had absolutely no part in. Think about it. Being held accountable and potentially punished for the actions of two individuals who lived thousands of years ago, it feels fundamentally unfair. It's like being penalized for a mistake your distant ancestors made, a concept that doesn't really align with our modern understanding of justice and individual responsibility. But the paradox deepens when you consider the nature of the God involved. If Allah is truly omniscient, all-knowing, then He would have known from the very beginning that Iblis would refuse to bow, that Adam and Eve would be tempted, and that they would ultimately eat from the forbidden tree. Nothing could have happened without His knowledge. Furthermore, if He's omnipotent, all-powerful, then He could have easily prevented any of this from happening in the first place. In fact, within the context of an all-powerful and all-knowing being, the very idea of betrayal seems a bit nonsensical. How can a created being truly betray its creator in a way that surprises or thwarts the creator's ultimate plan? If nothing happens without Allah's will, then wasn't this entire sequence of events, from Iblis's refusal to Adam and Eve's disobedience, part of His grand design? This leads to the unsettling conclusion that humans might just be playing out a predetermined script. If God knew the outcome from the start and allowed it to unfold exactly as it did, then our actions, including the supposed exercise of free will, start to feel less like genuine choices and more like fulfilling a role in a cosmic drama. And the stakes of this drama are incredibly high, with the potential for eternal torment in a hell that this same all-powerful being created. And even the promised reward in paradise comes with its own set of questions. We're told that in this eternal utopia, negative emotions will be removed. But are these emotions, sadness, anger, fear, not also part of what makes us human? If they are simply erased, are we still truly ourselves, or have we become something else entirely? It feels like even the supposed reward comes at the cost of a fundamental aspect of our being. So, when we examine the story of the fall of mankind through a rational lens, it raises some serious questions about fairness, logic, and the very nature of the divine being involved. Is it truly just to punish all of humanity for the actions of two individuals? Does the narrative make sense within the context of an all-knowing and all-powerful God? Or does it point towards a more human-centric explanation for our existence and the challenges we face? So, the standard Islamic belief is that Allah didn't just send the Prophet Muhammad. He sent a long line of prophets throughout history to various nations, all carrying essentially the same core message of monotheism and submission to God. The idea is that Islam is the original, pure religion, and other faiths that exist today are the result of human corruption and deviation from this original truth. But if this message was sent repeatedly across different eras and to diverse populations, you'd expect to find some consistent historical and archaeological evidence to back this up, right? Think about ancient civilizations like China, which boasts one of the longest continuous histories on the planet, stretching back thousands of years. Their foundational myths, their religious practices, their cultural values, they look nothing like early Islam. Where are the remnants of this original monotheistic message in their historical records? Even events that are central to Abrahamic faiths, like the story of a global flood during the time of Noah, or Nuh in Islam, don't seem to have left a significant, universally acknowledged mark on the historical accounts of many other major ancient civilizations. While flood myths exist in various cultures, the specifics and the context often differ dramatically. This lack of widespread corroboration raises questions about the universality of these events and the messages associated with them. Now, the common explanation for these discrepancies is that humanity repeatedly corrupted or abandoned God's message. But if an all-powerful, all-knowing God is trying to communicate something so vital, something with eternal consequences, and this message keeps getting distorted or lost time and time again, doesn't that point to a flaw in the method of communication itself? If a teacher keeps giving the same lesson to different groups of students over centuries, and they consistently fail to grasp it or misinterpret it, wouldn't you start to question the teacher's teaching methods rather than just blaming the student's inherent inability to learn? And it's not just about the lack of consistency across different cultures and time periods. Even within Islam itself, we see the emergence of various schools of thought and interpretations almost immediately following the Prophet Muhammad's death. The split between Shia and Sunni Muslims is a prime example, and over time, numerous other sects and subsects have arisen, each with their own nuances and interpretations of the core texts. This internal diversity doesn't exactly scream perfectly preserved and unalterable final message, does it? Furthermore, historical accounts and even certain hadith traditions point to the existence of different recitations and even potentially missing verses of the Quran in its early history. While mainstream Islamic belief holds that the Quran as we have it today is perfectly preserved, these historical details do raise questions about the initial transmission and compilation of the text. So when we look at the narrative of divine communication through prophets, we see a pattern of repeated failure, a lack of consistent historical evidence across different cultures, and even internal variations and questions within the supposedly final message itself. This begs the question: if God's message is so crucial for our eternal salvation, why would He choose a method of communication that seems so prone to error, misinterpretation, and ultimately failure? It makes you wonder if perhaps the message isn't divine in origin, but rather a product of human history and cultural evolution. If Allah's ultimate desire is for us, as creatures with free will, to believe in Him, wouldn't the most logical and effective way to achieve that be to, well, show Himself? If I wanted to convince you that I exist, I wouldn't send a message through a third party. I'd just present myself. So why the need for intermediaries? Why the prophets? The very act of sending prophets inherently shifts the focus of belief. Instead of directly believing in God, we're being asked to believe in the claims and experiences of another human being. These prophets, no matter how charismatic or convincing, are still just people. Their claims of divine encounters and revelations are, by their very nature, second-hand information for the rest of us. And let's be honest, the evidence for these prophetic claims is rarely, if ever, tangible or independently verifiable. We're asked to take the prophet's word for it, often based on ancient texts and historical accounts that are themselves subject to interpretation and potential inaccuracies. There are no contemporary witnesses to these direct divine communications that can corroborate the claims in a way that would stand up to any kind of rigorous scrutiny. Here's a particularly strange aspect of the Islamic narrative. While Allah chooses to communicate indirectly through a select few individuals, Iblis, the supposed embodiment of evil, and the one who wants to lead us astray, is said to have a direct line of communication to every single human being, able to whisper temptations into our ears until the end of time. Think about that asymmetry for a second. The being who wants us to believe has a less direct and less universally accessible communication strategy than the being who wants to deceive us. It seems rather counterintuitive, wouldn't you say? Ultimately, this reliance on belief in unverifiable claims makes the whole test feel inherently unfair. We're being judged on whether or not we accept a specific set of propositions based on faith, often without any compelling objective evidence. It's like being given a multiple-choice exam where the correct answers are hidden, and your grade depends on guessing what the examiner was thinking. So the question remains, why a hidden God who demands belief based on indirect communication and faith in the words of others? Why not a clear, unambiguous revelation that leaves no room for doubt? The fact that belief requires such a significant leap of faith in the absence of direct evidence makes me seriously question the logic and fairness of this entire setup. So, according to modern cosmology, the universe is estimated to be around 13.8 billion years old. That's a staggering amount of time. Now, within that immense time frame, our own species, Homo sapiens, has only been around for a tiny fraction of it, roughly a few 100,000 years. And, according to some interpretations of religious texts, including Islamic tradition, the story of Adam and Eve and the beginning of mankind, as we know it, might only go back about 6,000 years. Here's where the timeline gets a bit weird when you factor in an eternal God. If Allah is truly timeless, existing outside of the constraints of time, why did he choose to create this universe a mere 13.8 billion years ago? What was he doing for the countless eternities before that? Was there a cosmic snooze button he finally decided to turn off? One might jokingly speculate that perhaps Allah got bored after an eternity of, well, whatever an eternal being does, and decided to spice things up by creating a universe and eventually us. But that idea quickly falls apart when you consider the attributes typically ascribed to God: perfection, immutability, and omniscience. Boredom implies a lack or a dissatisfaction, which doesn't really fit with the concept of a perfect, self-sufficient being who knows all outcomes from the start. Then there's the sheer scale of the universe to consider. We're not just talking about our solar system. We're talking about billions of stars within our Milky Way galaxy, and billions of galaxies beyond that, stretching out into the observable universe. It's mind-bogglingly vast, and yet, the primary focus in many religious narratives, including Islam, seems to be on this one relatively small planet, Earth, and specifically on the actions of its human inhabitants, who have only been around for a blink of an eye in cosmic terms. Even with the concept of paradise and hell, and the anticipation of events like the arrival of the Mahdi, and ultimately doomsday, the focus remains firmly on Earth and the fate of humanity. There isn't a significant emphasis on exploring or understanding the rest of this immense universe that Allah supposedly created. It makes you wonder about the purpose of all those other galaxies and stars if the grand narrative revolves solely around this one planet. When you put all of this together, the relatively recent creation of the universe by an eternal being, the disproportionate focus on a tiny part of that universe, and the lack of exploration of the cosmos within religious doctrine, it starts to feel like this particular concept of God, with these specific concerns and this timeline, might be more of a reflection of human perspectives and our limited understanding of the universe at the time these ideas were developed, rather than an accurate portrayal of an eternal, all-powerful creator of such unimaginable vastness. Over the course of this video, we've delved into what I see as some fundamental issues within the traditional Islamic narrative. We started by questioning the very notion of a self-sufficient God, who seemingly requires and demands worship from his creation. We explored the implications of a creation process that appears to bypass our consent and sets us up for a test with potentially eternal and frankly terrifying consequences. We examined the idea of a divine being who seemingly guides some to salvation while predetermining others for hell, and we questioned whether the desire for constant adoration aligns with the concept of divine perfection. The central paradox that keeps coming up is this: if Allah is truly the eternally self-sufficient, independent being described in the Quran, then why the apparent need for worship? Why the creation of beings specifically for this purpose? It introduces an element of necessity that seems to contradict the very definition of al-Samad. And it leads us to some big, uncomfortable questions. If there's a God, what was the real motivation behind creating humanity? Was it out of some divine whim? Or is it part of a grand, predetermined plan that renders our free will somewhat illusory? What does the concept of paradise truly entail, especially if it involves the removal of fundamental human emotions? And what about hell? Can we reconcile the idea of an all-merciful God with the creation of a place designed for eternal, brutal punishment? If our freedom to shape our destinies isn't entirely our own, what does that say about our inherent value and dignity as individuals? It's important to remember that there's another perspective, one rooted in scientific inquiry. The evidence increasingly points towards life arising from natural processes, shaped by the elegant and powerful mechanism of evolution. This view doesn't necessarily provide all the answers to the why of existence, but it offers a framework based on observable evidence and testable hypotheses. Religions throughout history have undoubtedly provided comfort, community, and moral guidance for many. But it's also worth considering whether they might, at times, serve as tools for power, control, and the enforcement of specific social structures. The promise of eternal reward and the threat of eternal punishment can be incredibly effective motivators for adherence to certain doctrines and behaviors. Ultimately, the question of our existence and the nature of the universe is a profound one that has captivated humanity for millennia. But I firmly believe that the most honest and fruitful approach to these questions is one based on rational inquiry, critical thinking, and a willingness to challenge even the most deeply ingrained beliefs. Don't just accept what you're told. Ask questions, seek evidence, and come to your own conclusions. What do you think? I'd love to hear your perspectives in the comments below. Let's keep the discussion respectful and open-minded. If you found this video thought-provoking, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the Rational Farid for more discussions like this. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep thinking critically.